Next, on the Paleo Way. My crew and I take an eye-opening trip to Australia's southern island of Tasmania to see how Cape Grim beef gets its international reputation.
You're saying we should be focusing more on what they've been eating?
Yeah. Our paleo ancestors were hunter-gatherers. Today, we'll be featuring food of the hunter.
I don't think that you should cook something unless you can take its life.
It's called nose to tail.
I had an idea that organ meats were very nutrient-dense. I didn't know that they were that nutrient-dense.
From duck eggs with asparagus and bone marrow with Professor Neil Mann.
That's a primitive, healthy meal you've got there.
To beef heart skewers with chimichurri sauce with acclaimed chef Gavin Baker.
If you cook this for somebody and you just said it was steak,
They wouldn't know the difference.
From Cajun beef liver and avocado salad
Liver's like a multivitamin pill.
to a lazy person's lamb, voted the best main meal by my highly discerning crew.
you guys have got to try this.
I'm Pete Evans, and this is the Paleo Way.
So John, tell us where we are, mate.
Well, we're at Stanley in northwest Tasmania. We farm about 1,100 grass-fed beef cattle here. We've got three breeds. The black ones are Angus, the red ones South Devon, and these guys are Murray Greys.
So what's the difference in flavour?
I don't think you'll find one.
So let me get this straight. You're saying that we should be focusing more on what they've been eating than the actual breeds?
Yeah.
And what these beauties are eating is rich, lush grass.
We're lucky in this area that the temperature ranges between about 12 degrees in the winter and 25 Celsius in the summer, and that allows us to grow good quality pasture for much of the year. So these cattle are fed good quality nutritional pasture for most of their life.
And then John tells me something that took me by surprise. He and his fellow farmers don't consider themselves cattle ranchers, but rather...
The producers in this area have learned to be grass farmers before cattle farmers and produce the best quality pasture they can, and that's reflected in the quality of the meat.
Cows are ruminants.
Yes.
Explain what a ruminant is.
Well, they were evolved to eat grass. Grass is difficult to digest, so these guys do it very well. Like this guy here is chewing his cud. They get a belly full of grass, and then they regurgitate it, grind it all up, and then they have 4 stomachs that the grass passes through to get the best nutrition from it.
Now, you might not know this, but today, raising animals on pasture has become more the exception than the rule. Right after World War II, the United States had a surplus of urea, a nitrogen fertiliser used in bombs, so they decided to use it on corn. Then they had a surplus of corn and decided to feed it to cattle.
It's like chalk and cheese. The animals themselves are not meant to eat grain. They're not designed for it. They're ruminant animals.
So what happens to them?
Well, number one, they're not healthy. They have problems digesting it. And when they do, they put on a lot of fat. And then we eat that and we become unhealthy.
There seems to be a lot of correlation between the increase in intensive agriculture, the increase in use of antibiotics, the increase in use of hormones and therapies, the increase in feeding grain to an animal that can only really process grass. We started to see meat that was plentiful and cheap at the point of purchase, but there's a lot of science and evidence that right now says that actually it's not very cheap. We have a health issue with obesity, and I'm in that space myself. We have a health issue with antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and then we have significant environmental issues in terms of runoff, in terms of water pollution.
But there's a whole flip side of that coin that actually has exactly the opposite effect. Grazing animals, not uncoincidentally, evolved out on grasslands. Those two things co-evolved together for millions of years before we ever came along. And it turns out, if we use the grazing animal wisely, if we use it mimicking nature's own natural cycles, they're an integral part of actually improving the quality of the soil and of the plants that grow there.
When you've got cattle like this eating these natural grasses, this is as close as we can get to the real situation with wild animals. I mean, we know cattle are domesticated. We've converted what their wild ancestors were into these docile creatures today. But one thing we can do to make them healthy and make us healthy is let them keep eating what their ancestors did, same as we should keep eating what our ancestors did, and that way they're healthy, we'll get healthy meat from them.
So pastures and the grazing animals man-hunted both saw to each other's evolutionary welfare. Now, in that same spirit, let's make a dish our hunter ancestors would be proud of.
Now, Neil, I know you've done a lot of work about what's inside this bone here, so I thought I'd do a little dish here, which is bone marrow with asparagus and duck eggs. Eggs and asparagus just work really well together.
The bone marrow become a very nutritious, healthy meal.
It's got a bit of beef fat here, because would you encourage people to experimenting and get offal back into their diet?
It's probably a wise idea rather than waste it, because a lot of nutrients are in the offal. We've been so used to now eating the protein-rich part and avoiding the offal foods full of DHA, one of the omega-3s.
Got some asparagus?
Right.
Because we have to eat our vegetables.
Absolutely.
As you've
Plenty
told
of
me.
veggies.
Now tell me about bone marrow, because it is a wonder food.
It is, and it's very primitive of you, Peter. When we come down out of the trees as primitive primates 5 million years or something ago and started wandering around in lush grassland rather than the forests and jungles, there wasn't much for us to eat. And what our ancestors had to do, and they didn't have very big brains to figure this out, is they found bones left over from the kills of big carnivores. Is to come along with a great big rock and smash the bones and the skulls up and scoop out the brain and scoop out the bone marrow, and that become a very big part of our staple diet for a long time.
So you think this was part of our evolutionary process? We
Absolutely.
started eating marrow.
It's mostly fat and water, and fat meant life, it meant energy, calories, as they say in America, and that would be what they survive on.
What we're going to do is actually cook all this down in a bone broth, which is just a beef stock, basically. So lots of nutrients in there, all
I'm sure there
extracted.
is.
We've got some toasted pine nuts. Nuts are good for us.
I'm sure our ancestors ate a lot of those.
And some capers, so a little bit of that. That's going to give us some saltiness. And some fresh herbs and garlic. So we'll just season the broth, Neil. Some salt, some pepper. But this is it. This is as simple as the dish can get. I mean, eggs would have been a huge nutrient source for us in our ancestral days.
Absolutely, and not just birds' eggs, reptile eggs as well.
Cooking it in the broth not only intensifies the flavour, but you get all this goodness, so it's nearly like a bit of a soup.
The bone marrow just started to melt a little.
Just softened it ever so slightly.
That's a primitive, healthy meal you've got there. You've got virtually all your various vitamins and minerals. You've got fat, protein. The only thing you haven't got a lot of there is carbohydrate, which is what our ancestors didn't have a lot of for a long, long time until agriculture. So I'm flabbergasted to see someone in contemporary society take these ideas and then artistically combine it into a very, very healthy meal. That's amazing. You know what, Pete? You should be a chef.
Thanks, mate.
That tastes good.
You should be a professor.